I'm not sure I expected a crowd quite this size, but this is very exciting. Good evening. My name is Julius Scott. I teach history at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I'm very pleased to be with you as sort of the moderator and the MC this evening for what promises to be a real interesting and timely discussion that commemorates the bicentennial of a very important period in the history of this Commonwealth, this city, and this country. It's one of the most intriguing counterfactuals in all of American history. The what-if question concerning a plot designed by slaves in Richmond and the surrounding countryside to strike a violent blow for freedom in the late summer of 1800. Gabriel's conspiracy, as we have come to know it. What if, on the evening of August 30th, a sudden violent storm with torrential rains had not settled over the area, complicating the plans of Thomas Prosser's slave, Gabriel? We're gathered here this evening, 200 years later, to commemorate and reflect upon Gabriel's conspiracy. What it tells us about the world of 1800, about the 18th century and that was passing at that time, and the 19th century that was sort of coming on. And also, I guess, to talk a little bit more wide-rangingly about sort of some of the implications of this incident and its remembrance in our current situation. And I understand that there's certain issues that are very timely around this issue, which makes this an even more interesting point in time for us to be having this commemoration this evening. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble reading my handwriting here. In many ways, in addition to the sort of the counterfactual question, which we may or may not get to tonight, there's also a kind of an interesting way in which Gabriel's rebellion represents, along with Shays' rebellion in the mid-1780s, or the Whiskey Rebellion of the mid-1790s, a kind of epilogue to the period of the American Revolution. But an epilogue that really reflected, in some ways, as these other issues did, some of the unachieved goals of freedom and equality in the state of Thomas Jefferson's birth. The man who would, just weeks later, become the President of the United States. In order to frame our discussion, our reflection, our looking back and looking forward this evening, we are extremely fortunate to have really a dynamite panel of commentators. I can't imagine that for the kind of discussion that we want to have, we could have three better people in terms of helping us to have our dialogue this evening. We have three speakers. And I will introduce them now in the order in which they will speak. And then what we will do is have them speak, and then after they're given their comments, we do want to engage in some give and take with the audience. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Douglas Egerton. Professor Egerton teaches history at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. He's the author of 3 books, including Gabriel's Rebellion, the Virginia Slave Conspiracies of 1800 and 1802. And most recently, he's the author of He Shall Go Out Free, The Lives of Denmark Vesey. Professor Egerton will be our first speaker. He'll be followed by Professor James Sidbury of the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Sidbury is the author of the book Plowshares into Swords, Race, Rebellion, and Identity in Gabriel's Virginia 1730 through 1810. And Professor Sidbury is currently working on a book that traces black discourse on Africa and Africanness from the 1760s through the 1830s. And finally, we're fortunate to have with us this evening as our third speaker, the Reverend Dwight Jones. Reverend Jones is senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of South Richmond and the St. James Baptist Church in Verina. A former member of the Richmond City School Board, he now serves in the Virginia House of Delegates. So welcome to an evening of reflection on the Bicentennial of Gabriel's Rebellion. We do really want to encourage your active participation, and let's hear from our speakers. Professor Egerton.
Thank you. You can tell that Julius is at a big university. I'm at a small liberal arts college, and my biggest class is about 25 students, and I've got no microphone. So I'm going to try to kind of emote. We have wires, but no mic. If you can't hear in the back, I'll try to talk louder. So if you can't hear, just sort of do one of these. I want to thank Dr. Woody Holton for thank you. For inviting me to come speak tonight. I'd also like to thank the university for sponsoring this very important symposium on the Bicentennial of Gabriel's Rebellion. How best to remember this young man, this 24-year-old slave who gave his life for American freedom? I've been reading the ongoing debates in the Richmond Times-Dispatch on the web, reading about the stories regarding the Caroline County Monument and the question of how to celebrate Gabriel there, or if not to. Reading letters to the editor, exalting Gabriel as a freedom fighter, and also reading letters denouncing him as a would-be murderer. What I'd like to do tonight is three quick things. I'd like to explain who I think he was, why it really is hard to know much with certainty about this young slave, and therefore, that'll lead to my second point, why there are differences of interpretation when it comes to Gabriel's conspiracy. Some differences I have with Dr. Sidbury and Dr. Schwartz, who's in the audience. I think we disagree by one on the number of people who died in the conspiracy. And then third, finally, I'm going to be foolish enough to kind of wade into this debate on statues and monuments, and I flew all the way here from Syracuse, so I thought I'd just, have a vote. First, the question is, who was Gabriel? I find that my students like to know things with absolute certainty. For anybody who wants to know things with certainty, you should stay away from early American black history. That, I guess, to a certain degree is true for all fields. I suspect that many presidents lied to their autobiographies as well as they lied to the American public. But recapturing the life of the so-called historical inarticulate, working class people who don't leave behind the kind of diaries and letters and treaties and documents and wills that historians really love to use, is especially difficult. What we know for sure about this young man is not much. Very likely he was born just outside of Richmond on the Brookfield plantation owned by old Thomas Prosser. The plantation is gone. It's Brookfield Road today. Also very likely, he was born in the year of 1776. In 1800, at the time of his conspiracy, his then owner, Thomas Henry Prosser, said with a great deal of certainty that he was born in 1776, pardon me, that he was 24 years old. And that means he knew exactly when he was born, and so my guess is he was born on Brookfield, and he was born in 1776. In 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, Virginia conducted a massive census. It was the only time that the Virginia census listed slaves by name, as opposed to simply by property, that is, by number. And there was Gabriel, 7 years old. And there was his brother Solomon, and there was also his much older brother Martin, who I suspect may in fact have been his half-brother because they had different occupations as adults. But the census listed slaves by name, not by family group. And so there's no way to look at this list to find out who Gabriel's parents are. So I was never able to discover who his parents were, what their names were, Were they born in Virginia? Were they African Americans, which is probably likely? Were they Africans, which is possible but unlikely? I mean, there's just not much one can say with certainty about his childhood. But that also tells us a lot. It tells us a great deal about the dehumanizing nature of American slavery. Here is one of the most important men in the Revolutionary era. And we don't know for sure where exactly he was born. We don't know for sure exactly when he was born. It gets worse. His wife, known as Nanny, appears exactly once in the trial documents. We don't know if Nanny is her name or forename. We don't know if it's an occupational nickname. I was never able to discover who owned Nanny. I could not find her in the 1783 census. I couldn't discover what happened to her after Gabriel's conspiracy collapsed. The only time she appears in the trial documentation is August 30. There she's at Brookfield, getting ready for the conspiracy to start, and after that, she's gone. I guessed in my book, and it was just a guess, that most likely Gabriel had children. He's 24 years old. It would be very odd if he did not have children. Several years ago, I was back down in Richmond. They were putting up several historical markers to Gabriel, one out near Brookfield, one near Young Spring. I met a wonderful gentleman, an older man who grew up in Henrico County, who went to school back in the days of segregation. He said when he was in high school, there were several young men named Randolph who were commonly understood to be descendants of Gabriel. If true, that meant that Gabriel did have a family, and whatever else it means that as white Americans forgot about Gabriel or tried to forget about Gabriel, that his name was kept alive, his legend was kept alive in the black community. As a young man, he was trained as a blacksmith, as a plantation artisan, as was his brother Solomon. Probably, again, another guess, that was his father's occupation. Slaves, of course, pardon me, because my voice already, slaves were not allowed to acquire property beyond the odd table or chair, but one thing they could do was pass their skill and occupation on to the next generation. So quite often, children of blacksmiths or carpenters became the next generation of blacksmiths or carpenters, and children of house domestics became the next generation of domestics. He grew into a giant of a man, well over 6 feet tall, and by the time he was in his early 20s, his arms betrayed more than a decade in the forge. He was just a giant guy. He was literate. Again, we don't know how, but only about 5% of slaves at the time were literate. And that meant Gabriel had information. He had access to knowledge, and therefore he had great power. All these things add up to somebody being a natural leader in black Virginia society. Very large man, he's a young man, he's literate, he's incredibly bright. He's got what passes for one of the skilled jobs in his day. And we also know with certainty he had very little prejudice against violence. His front teeth were gone, 24, he had scars on his face, and my guess is those scars came from mixing it up in the plantation quarters. And in 1799, as Dr. Schwartz wrote years ago, not too long ago, sorry, in a really wonderful article in Virginia Magazine, a white neighbor caught Gabriel stealing a hog. Slaves often did that. It was a way of getting protein on the table. The white neighbor berated Gabriel, and of course slaves are supposed to play the game. Shuffle their feet, look down at the ground, apologize. Instead, Gabriel threw the neighbor to the ground, beat him up, and bit off the left ear. Now, that was a capital crime. Black men were not supposed to bite white neighbors in 1799. But there was a curious loophole in the law called benefit of clergy, and so therefore Gabriel escaped the noose that year. Beyond that, sort of really bare bones biography. There's not much we can say with great certainty. After that, it becomes speculation. It was, of course, conventional wisdom that Gabriel was a deeply religious slave. And when I began the project, my assumption was that he was sort of a black Afro-Baptist evangelical. Obviously, he did know the Bible. He could not claim benefit of clergy unless he could quote from the Bible. But I was surprised to discover almost a total lack of references in the trial documents to religion, to Christianity. And so I came to believe that Gabriel was a secular revolutionary, much in the mold of Thomas Jefferson or Tom Paine, and he left his religion to his brother Martin. I can't prove that I'm right, of course. The fact that there's not much in the documentation doesn't mean there's not sort of missing documents or depositions that were never given that would have information I would love to have. And so here, Jim and I disagree, and I think Jim's going to talk more about that in a few minutes. I will say, though, that I've become even more convinced that I'm right based upon my recent research on Denmark Vesey, who was deeply religious and deeply enamored of the Old Testament. In those trial documents, I found 24 references to the Old Testament. 23 come from Denmark Vesey. And that, I think, sort of by comparison, that the utter lack, or almost lack, of religious references in the Gabriel transcripts say a lot. But again, Jim will talk more about that in a minute. Let me conclude by emphasizing what all writers of Gabriel's world would agree on. That he was an American revolutionary whose goal was to forge a more egalitarian world in Jefferson's Virginia. Here was a man born in that important year of 1776. That year when another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, announced that all people had certain rights that simply could not be denied them. Jefferson enumerated these rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And here he was, raised amidst all this heady talk of liberty and freedom and natural rights. There was a letter to the editor of the Richmond paper on September 14. The writer said that Gabriel, quote, did not intend to lead a slave revolt. That he just wanted to kill white people, unquote. And of course, as probably all of you know, last week Caroline County voted not to mention Gabriel's men, specifically Jack Gabriel. The paper misidentified them as the same person. But Jack Gabriel was Gabriel's chief lieutenant in Caroline County. They voted not to mention any of Gabriel's men or Jack Gabriel on the monument in Caroline County to black Virginians. One of those who went apparently to the hearing and spoke against mentioning Gabriel's conspiracy was a former sheriff of the county who apparently once arrested a couple for the crime of interracial love. He said, quote, he didn't think black people should be proud of Gabriel. Well, I know I don't get a vote on this, but I'm going to have mine anyway. And my vote is that all Americans, white and black, should be proud of Gabriel and what he stood for and what he fought for. Let me be clear about this. In Gabriel's war on slavery, people were going to die. He was not a pacifist. This was a war on slavery, and slaveholders who held other people as human chattel were going to perish in his war. It's also worth noting there was a very long list of anti-slavery whites who were to be spared, who were not to be touched by Gabriel's soldiers. French nationals, Quakers, Methodists. He said poor white women who don't own slaves were not to be harmed. I mean, this was a war, and he identified certain people who would be warriors on his side and against his side. His goal was freedom, not murder. In any war, people die, but that's not the goal. In any war, World War II, my father fought, people die to achieve a goal. That's not the goal itself. In talking against the monument, there was an assistant principal in Caroline County. He said he just couldn't endorse Gabriel's methods because at his school he teaches his students to resolve their problems peacefully. And I understand that. I have two young daughters. One became 13 yesterday, a teenager. I understand the importance of resolving issues peacefully. But in history, context is everything. And we learn nothing from the past if we ignore that context. And the fact is, a classroom in the 21st century is not a tobacco plantation in the 18th century. I once had a very sweet, very gifted student write a paper, comparative analysis of Nat Turner and Martin Luther King. And he said, you know, Dr. King had it right, and Nat Turner was wrong. It was a thoughtful paper, but it lacked context. You know, Martin's world was not Gabriel's world. And let me be blunt. You show me a slave who tries to lead a peaceful protest march, I will show you a dead slave hanging from a tree branch. I think it's instructive and curious that last summer, millions of Americans, probably most of them white, plunked down good money to see Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, a character based loosely on Francis Marion, a South Carolina planter and slaveholder. In the movie, Francis Marion stabbed, shot, sliced, butchered, a sea of Englishmen, so that the South Carolina planter class could live free. But then you start talking about blacks doing the same thing, and people get very nervous. Where's the movie about Gabriel? Where's the movie about Nat Turner? About Denmark Vesey? The fact is, people like Gabriel, raised in Virginia after 1776, had examples. One was George Washington. Washington taught men like Gabriel by example that the path to freedom was to pound a plowshare into a sword, to use the title of Jim's book. We stand here tonight in a city lined with the statues built for men who fought against black freedom in 1861. We stand here in a state that recognizes Confederate Appreciation Month, and I say that as the great-great-grandson of a North Carolina planter and a Confederate veteran. But I'm not trying to suggest that Gabriel simply is the black counterpart of Francis Marion. On August 10, 1800, Gabriel and his men had a meeting at Young Spring. There's a sign there now. He called his men together. He said he had a plan for his country. Not a plan for black freedom, a plan for his country. He was going to make American patriots practice what they preached. He would make this a country that didn't just talk about liberty and freedom and natural rights, but a country that actually practiced liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness. Let me summarize with 2 points. In talking about the Carrollton County Monument, Ms. Cleo Coleman said it best. She said, quote, "Until we accept Gabriel, we accept the myth that slaves were content," unquote. To that I would add, until we recognize that his cause was just and that freedom is a good thing for all people, we romanticize the past and therefore learn nothing from it. And we also ignore the role that corporate collective violence, from Metacom's war to the Gulf War, has played in the formation of this country. Thank you.
I have to say, I start off a little nervous because Doug has an excuse for people having a hard time hearing him, whereas I teach at a university where I have very large classes, and I know everybody heard him fine, so the pressure is now on. I do also want to start by thanking everyone at the University of Richmond for their wonderful hospitality, starting with a young woman whose name I don't know, who saw me wandering completely lost around campus and was kind enough to show me where the alumni house was, and had she not done that, I'd still be wandering around campus, would not be here. And especially to thank Dr. Holt for arranging this, for inviting us. And certainly, I am selfishly pleased to be here and to get a chance to do this, but I also think that the much more important point is that this is, it is high time that there were commemorations of Gabriel, as Doug has made clear. Woody asked us to, or he didn't ask, but he suggested that one of the things that might be useful is if Doug and I made clear why we do differ about certain things in Gabriel's conspiracy. Now, alas, I hate to disappoint you, that doesn't mean that we're going to engage in a food fight up here. But it does mean that what I'm going to do, having allowed Doug to sort of tell the story of the tale, and then he very slyly and subtly there fit in the main area we disagree with, I'm now going to focus on that, on the question of Gabriel's ideology or of the role of religion in the conspiracy at any rate. But I want to start instead by talking about the difference between what each of us set out to do, because I think that has a lot to do with the way in which, with the approaches we ended up taking to some of this and the things that we came to believe about the conspiracy itself. That is, Doug has written a wonderful history of Gabriel's conspiracy. The first line of my book, for the 2 or 3 of you who haven't read it, is that the book is not about Gabriel's conspiracy. That is, I didn't set out to write a book about Gabriel's conspiracy thinking that Doug had gotten it wrong. Instead, what I wanted to do was to try to get inside the cultural world of black Richmonders at the time in which Richmond was becoming the capital, well, it had become the capital of Virginia, and was becoming an important urban place. And so I was attracted to the conspiracy not because it was a central and crucial and very important moment in the struggle for American freedom, though it was. That is, it's not that I don't believe that at all. But what I found most fascinating about it was a moment in which, and a distressingly unusual moment, as anyone who has worked in this field could testify, in which, at least to some degree, one could begin to get mediated but relatively clear transcriptions of enslaved people talking about their perceptions of the world. And so what I wanted to do was not explain Gabriel's conspiracy, but use Gabriel's conspiracy as a window through which I could try to get a picture of the world of black Richmonders, Gabriel's Virginia, as I came to call it. And so I set about to write a cultural history of the conspirators' world, not a history of the conspiracy itself. Having said that, it is thus true that there are very, very large areas of agreement. Most of what either of us would have to say about the conspiracy itself, the other would agree with, I think. At least I can say that for myself. I should let Doug speak for himself. There was, though, one relatively major issue that we came to differ about. And that involved the role of religion in the conspiracy, as the title of my book lets on fairly clearly. I do think that biblical interpretation and Christianity played a really central role in the way in which the conspirators conceived of their world, the way in which they conceived of freedom, and the ways in which they went about trying to win it. Doug, as he said, sees the conspiracy as an almost purely secular affair. In one of the characteristically really wonderfully clear and punchy sentences in his book, he says that freedom was Gabriel's only religion, that was the thing Gabriel believed in and the thing he perceived or sought. I, on the other hand, really do see Christianity as absolutely central to Gabriel's world. So what I want to do in the little bit of time I have is first of all try to explain why I think I'm right about this. Doug's already told you why he thinks I'm wrong about it. And I will do that. I'll spend a little bit of time on that, and I'll talk some about the evidence. But what I want to focus on more than that is to continue the discussion that Doug started about why we can disagree on that. That is, why it is so difficult to get inside the perceptions of people living in that, enslaved people living in that time especially, all people to some degree, but especially enslaved people living in that period. And so I am going to talk about the specific sources that I use and the way I look at them for, you'll be relieved to know, a relatively brief period of time. But then instead, what I will talk more about is the sort of games that we each have to play in interpreting those and figuring out how to make sense of the little snapshots of the conspiracy that we do get through the sources that were produced. Again, incredibly rich sources by the standards of what has survived that will allow us to get into the experiences of most black Virginians at the time. First, though, I'll give you the evidence for my reading. Okay? Now, part of the evidence is broad and contextual. As Doug says, context is everything in history. And Gabriel's conspiracy came along at a time in which the Baptist church especially, the evangelical Christian churches more broadly, that is the Methodists as well, we're reaching out into broad parts of Virginia's population trying to convert people to worship their God. That is the God that these people believed in. And it was, in many ways, one of the sort of really remarkable moments in American religious history. That is, these Baptist churches in Virginia at that time were certainly the most racially integrated institutions in Virginia at the time. I think it's very possibly true they were the most racially integrated religious institutions that have existed in the United States in history. That is, these were truly interracial churches in which congregations were often close to half white, half black, more frequently slightly more black than white, but remarkably integrated. It's not just that we know that these churches were very important in the lives of many black Virginians. We do, and black Richmonders in particular. We do. It's also true that many of the recruiting rituals, the ceremonies or the rituals through which Gabriel and other leaders would go about trying to convince other enslaved people to join them in this fight for freedom took place immediately following religious services. Many of them took place at a church that was very close to here, is no longer there. It was called the Hungry Meeting House. It is unfortunate that the records from the Hungry Meeting House don't exist, which is one of the reasons that we end up not being able to say lots of things with the kind of certainty we would like to. We don't know who was a member of that church. But we do know that Gabriel and his brothers attended services there frequently in the summer of 1800, and that afterwards, on a number of occasions, they asked the black worshipers who had attended there, remember it's an integrated church, to go with them away and to go to a spring, and they attempted to convince them then to join them in the conspiracy. Now Doug very aptly points out that they also recruited at barbecues, they recruited at fish fries, they recruited lots of places, and this was one of the places one could find large numbers of people congregated. So again, it's not a kind of a clenching piece of evidence, but it's another sort of part of this context that makes me think that religion was very important. Another small, but all of the pieces of evidence in the end, or many of them anyway, are small pieces that have to be fit together, involves one of the very few letters, maybe the only letter. I was trying to remember, I think it is the only letter extant that we can reliably say, or actually I think the only one that's even attributed to a conspirator. And it's a letter that was found in which the writer of the letter says to the people of Gloucester County that Brother X is coming to preach a sermon to tell them about the business. Now, the business was one of the euphemisms that the conspirators used to talk about the conspiracy, so that it would be so that if they were overheard, it wouldn't be clear what they were talking about. Now, it seems to me that if preaching a sermon is going to tell about the business, that it's likely that religion is playing a central role in this. Now, all of these are the little pieces. There's one much more central piece of evidence to me about this, and it involves a single meeting. It's one moment during the conspiracy that found its way into the records. And it's a key meeting sometime in August, probably August 10th, in which the leadership was getting together trying to decide when they were going to proceed with the business, to go on with the conspiracy. The only picture we have of it is in the confession of a man named Ben Woolfolk. The confession is one of the richest and certainly it is a problematic piece of evidence, but it's one of the richest pieces of evidence we have from the conspiracy. And according to Woolfolk, the discussion started with one of the important leaders suggesting that the conspiracy be postponed, that they put it off. He doesn't say why he suggests that. Okay. But he does say that Gabriel opposed the suggestion. He says that rather than speaking for himself, Gabriel, and now I'm quoting, proposed that the subject should be referred to Martin, his brother, to decide upon. Okay. Now, Woolfolk didn't explain why Martin turned to Gabriel. I mean, why Gabriel turned to Martin. Sorry about that. Okay. But a contemporary white attributed, at any rate, to Martin's attributed Martin's authority to his, quote, acquaintance with the Holy Scriptures. And the exchange that followed bears that out. Martin began by warning that, quote, there was an expression in the Bible that says delays bring danger. Okay? And so he called on his comrades to rise now, not to put it off, to rise now, and then he gave a slew of secular reasons that they should do so. He said that there was peace, that the soldiers had been discharged, that is, there had been some U.S. Army soldiers who were in the area and they had been discharged. The militia arms were all in storage. The guns that the militia had were in terrible shape during that period, and so the governor called them all back in, had sent them off to Philadelphia to get fixed. They'd come back, but they were all still in storage. They hadn't been distributed. And so the militias were not particularly well armed at that point. Not at all armed, if you believe the captains who wrote in complaining about the lack of guns. Okay. And so he said they should go now, that this was the moment to pursue freedom. Okay. Now, Ben Woolfolk said that Ben Woolfolk himself then disagreed. Okay. And he disagreed in the following terms. This is what he said at that point. I told them that I had heard in the days of old when the Israelites were in servitude to King Pharaoh, they were taken from him by the power of God and were carried away by Moses. God had blessed them with an angel to go with him, but that I could see nothing of that kind in these days. And Martin responded with an explicit biblical quotation from Leviticus. It's slightly compressed, though we can't tell whether Martin himself compressed it or Ben Woolfolk did in his memory. But he said, I read in my Bible where God says if we will worship him, we shall have peace in all our lands. 5 of you shall conquer 100 and 100,000 of our enemies. Okay. Now, this discussion only makes sense to me if Christianity played a central and active role in the insurrectionary movement of the world. Okay. In the way they believed they should resist slavery, that is, they conceived themselves as a chosen people who were going to be led by a leader who was blessed by God out of slavery. Okay. Now, there are two things that I think are particularly important about that in that regard. First, is the fact that the Bible was used to such decisive effect in such an important meeting. This is a really crucial moment in the conspiracy. This is a moment when one of the people who has led it up until now is, for quite understandable reasons, this was really dangerous stuff, getting very nervous and wanted to back out. That is, I mean, we can't know this, but it seems likely that postponing was going to be something that was going to go on for a long time, right? To postpone once was likely to mean that they would give up this effort. Okay. And at this crucial meeting, the Bible is invoked as the piece of evidence that's going, or the authority that's going to turn the tides. But even more important, I think, is the sort of way in which biblical citation is so central a part of the worlds of these people. That the move from secular to sacred, to the Bible says danger, a delay breeds danger, to the militias the guns aren't with the militia, the soldiers have been discharged. This sort of seamless movement back and forth suggests that the way these people were seeing their world was one in which their role as chosen people, their sense of themselves as chosen people, was quite central to the way they perceived their world and their options. Now, there's some other less powerful traces of evidence that Christianity informed the conspiracy, but really my case for it rests largely on this exchange and the way it can be understood in light of what we know about the role of evangelical churches in the area at that time. Now, if I succeeded in making my case, right, many of you must now be asking yourselves how anyone as smart and talented as Doug could possibly question this, right? I can tell you that none of what I just told you is evidence that I found and he didn't see, right? He read Woolfolk's confession. He thought about that exchange. And he decided that it wasn't nearly as revealing as I think it is. Right? He was much more struck by the fact, as he mentioned, that it was the only explicit mention of religion in the trials. And it is. It is the only time they explicitly make reference to this. And by the fact that Gabriel himself stayed out of the discussion. Right? Gabriel said, I'll turn it over to my brother Martin to speak about this. So really our difference in the end, I think, comes down in part to a question of how important this single piece of evidence is. Right? It's not that one of us saw the evidence and the other didn't. We both saw it, and we differ about how much difference it makes in understanding what was going on there. And that disagreement seems to me to bring to the fore something that's ultimately probably much more important than which of us you happen to decide is right on this particular question. By virtue of being here, I presume that everyone here would agree with Doug and I that trying to recover this history is a really important thing, right? That trying to get into these worlds in which evidence is quite often very scarce, and even when existing is quite problematic, is a project that's worth pursuing. And I'm sure, even if you've not spent quite as much of your life thinking about it as Doug and I, you were aware coming in that the evidence was pretty scarce and hard to get at. That trying to get at the lives of enslaved people in this period was difficult because the written record was controlled by masters, and so to get enslaved people's perceptions is hard. Now, as I noted earlier, I was really drawn to Gabriel's conspiracy, less for the conspiracy itself than for the very opportunity he gave to do that. That is, this moment in which two people can read the same things and come to such different conclusions is one of the richest moments of this sort in the record for Virginia in the early period, and certainly before the antebellum period. And when I was trying to figure out how to convey a way of understanding what makes the stuff that has survived that seems so rich also so scarce, the metaphor that struck me, the analogy, I guess it really is, that struck me, was to think of what would happen if you were asked to review a movie, right? That is, think of the history of this period as a movie, right? But the review, you were asked to write the review when you were only given a certain number of the still frames from the movie. And you didn't know which still frames you got, right? You had 40, but you really didn't know whether there were 500 still frames or 2,000 still frames, right? And you didn't know what order they went in. You had to try to figure that out yourself and put it together in all the ways you could. And then you had to take that and try to describe what the whole movie was about. This discussion in which Woolfolk reports this exchange about the Bible is one snapshot. I came to believe that it was probably a still shot that represented lots of still shots. And there are reasons I think that the other still shots didn't get into it, but they're not very important, I don't think. We can go into them if you want afterwards, but they don't seem to me crucial right now. But Doug came to think it was the one still shot in which this happened. Maybe not the one, but there were far fewer. Right? There was a much less central part of the conspiracy. Yeah. On some level, that's what all history writing is about. That is, it's not just the quote-unquote inarticulate, which of course does not mean they were inarticulate at all, as Doug made clear. It means that what they said hasn't survived. Okay. But it's not just the quote-unquote inarticulate for whom we have little snapshots of history. In any world short of that in the Truman Show, right? You only get a little, very small piece of anyone's life when you're trying to think through it. It's a much, much more vexed problem in the case of early African American history, especially prior to the antebellum period, than it is for most kinds of history. I do want to be clear, though, that that's not to say that there are no ways to make judgments about what motivated Gabriel and his followers to attempt to overthrow slavery and lay claim to the revolutionary heritage of Virginia. Part of the evidence of that is that what I've done is focus on what Doug and I both think is an important part of the conspiracy, but neither of us thinks is the whole thing. And the vast majority of the conspiracy we don't differ on very much at all. And secondly, I'm absolutely convinced I'm right. As of course is Doug. I know Doug and I both hope that if you're interested enough in this, you'll go buy both of our books and read and make up your own mind. And when you do that, you won't just be deciding who you want to believe in. We both have reasoned arguments, and you can decide how to do that. It's not that there are no standards for thinking about these things, but it is true that this crucially important project of remembering Gabriel and of remembering the history of half of the people who lived in Virginia in 1800 is one that's very difficult and very vexed and leads to different kinds of interpretations precisely because the pictures we get of it in the records are so complicated and often so limited, and maybe even more importantly, because we'll never know how limited. We can't be sure what parts of it we don't have. Thank you.
The two preceding speakers began by thanking those who invited them, and I want to begin by saying I don't thank anybody for my invitation, because I really don't know what my role is here today, because I don't have a dog in the fight between these two professors. And I find it very difficult to step out of my persona as a black man in America and deal with the issue of Gabriel's rebellion simply from an academic context, but rather I deal with it rather from the perspective of one who is a descendant of Gabriel and one who yet lives in a society that has remnants of what Gabriel had to deal with. There are some similarities that perhaps might have caused me to be invited here tonight. I am pastor of a church that is 179 years old and has only had 5 black pastors in that 179-year history. Began in 1821, and because of persons like Gabriel and Nat Turner, there was a time in the history of our church when we did not have the opportunity to have black ministers for black congregations, because laws were passed forbidding black people to assemble under the leadership of black preachers, which may add to the thought patterns of the preceding speaker. Also, in reading for this presentation tonight, I found that Thomas Prosser was a member of the House of Burgesses, and now I know why I'm a member of the House of Delegates. Basically, I'm here today because I'm simply a black man with an opinion. And as I reflect upon what has been said here tonight, and simply want to answer the question why we should celebrate Gabriel's rebellion, it comes to my mind that the first thing that is important to me is that it puts a face on slavery. That for many of us, we hear about slavery and we digest it academically and lethargically, and we never really put a face on it. But in reading about Gabriel, it provides for me, and hopefully for you, an opportunity to give humanity to persons who are considered as chattel, and an opportunity to recognize that many of our stereotypical definitions of who a slave is or was are not correct. These gentlemen who have done so much research, for which we are grateful, have allowed us to know that Gabriel was an artisan, he was a craftsman, he had a vocation, that he was literate, that he had a family, that he had a support system, those who stood with him and stood by him, who helped him to come to the conclusions that he drew. He had a questing nature, as evidenced by the rebellion and putting together such a scheme. He was not domesticated. He was not stripped of a will to escape the conditions under which he was living. He had desire for freedom and a desire to take from society what was good and reject from society what was bad. and I do not have the overwhelming degree of literature and research that my co-presenters have, but I want to suggest that Gabriel was able to look at the society in which he lived and wanted to, in a moral sense, lift up a new paradigm for a culture that had become so capitalistically intoxicated that they were not able to recognize the humanness of those who they were making a living on the backs of. I see him as the one that I admire because of his radical persona, and Professor Egerton has said that he was more than radical, but that he was a revolutionary. And if you would agree with me that slavery was a heinous institution, it called for somebody to be a revolutionary, not content with his situation. The second thing that I see in just bringing up this notion of Gabriel's rebellion is a frustration, a personal frustration on my part. As a black man in America in the year 2000, I'm frustrated in my inclination to let bygones be bygones. Frustrated in my inclination to want everybody to just get along. Because when I think about slavery and when I think about the harshness of such an institution, I find it difficult to come down on the side of those who would like to sweep it under the rug and forget that it happened and take no responsibility for it. In many of the circles in which I travel, there are those who suggest to me that I had nothing to do with it, therefore I should not have to pay for it. And I would like to suggest that perhaps we don't have to pay for it, but certainly we have to recognize it. And certainly we have to give it standing. And certainly we have to, if not apologize, certainly we have to go into some type of redemptive activity that allows this country to know that what happened was certainly not something that we can be proud of. I had the privilege this summer to travel to Africa and to Accra, go to Ghana, and there on the Gold Coast there I had the opportunity to go to the Cape Coast castles, and if I was not angry before, I was angry then. When I saw the conditions under which those who came to America were placed in dungeons, where there were no places for bathrooms, where slaves were caused to be overcrowded, in places where excrement was present, where there was only an opening about the size of an air conditioning unit for ventilation and for light, and then to see the door of no return was a telling story for me, as I recognized that those who were in slavery were taken from their families and from what was near and dear to them and brought not up the Hudson but through the Middle Passage in order that this land might be built upon their backs. A staff writer in Sunday's paper asked the question whether or not Gabriel Prosser was an inspiring murderer or a freedom fighter, and to me, the answer is very clear. Just before I do that, however, and you know, this is amazing to me that I'll be the briefest of the speakers. Usually that's not the case. And I believe everybody can hear me. But I also want to mention that Gabriel's rebellion also suggests the residual effects of slavery's divisive nature upon our people, and I'm talking about upon black society, because as I read and as I listened to our moderator suggest, what if the rebellion had been successful, I also recognize that it was not just the driving rain, but it was those persons, those informants in the slave culture who had been taught that their loyalty should go to the power holder. It was those domesticated slaves who had been taught that their greatest affinity should be not to each other and not for the greater good of the brotherhood and the sisterhood, but rather they thought for themselves rather than thinking for the group. And while we have kind of looked at the issue of Caroline County tonight, I think that vestiges of what happened in Gabriel's rebellion are still apparent today in society, as we have those who are accommodating and we have those who are willing to stand up for what we consider to be great and deserved freedoms. And so I answer the question by saying I see Gabriel Prosser as a leader. I see him as a change agent. I see him as a man of considerable strength. I see him not as a villain, as some in the article would have suggested, but rather I see him as a victor. I see him not as a slave, but I see him as a brother who is a fellow human being. I see him as a caged bird who could not be at peace until he was able to spread his wings and be free. I see him as a talented and skillful leader who was able to, amidst great threat of recrimination, call out 600 slaves. Can you imagine? 600 slaves who knew that the result of their activity in such a plan would be death by hanging. But 600 slaves were called out by a man of this great character in order that they might find their freedom. Defeated not by natural elements, but defeated by a minority of individuals who thought that it was better to go along in order to get along. And so the legend lives as illustrated by the Caroline County event that is going on now. The legend lives on. And of course, the legend cannot die because there is great appreciation for black people, for those who stand up for justice and who stand up for that which we believe to be true. And many of the things that have been mentioned here tonight have a thread of connectivity to what goes on in black culture today. If the meeting took place at church, then that is perhaps why the meeting still takes place at church. Nothing happens in the black community that is not blessed by the church. And every movement of circumstance and every movement of any accountability of any account has its beginning in the church. And so we see in what has been said here tonight much of what happens in today's world. And so I applaud our meeting tonight, and I am grateful for the opportunity to vote. And I don't have a vote in Caroline County, but if it comes before the General Assembly of Virginia, I will vote yea, because Gabriel Prosser must be remembered. But not only must he be remembered, but all of the freedom fighters who had the courage to stand against the odds of losing their lives and to call slavery what it was, a heinous, dehumanizing system that caught America in a point of moral degradation. All of those persons, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, have got to be recognized as individuals who stepped out of the crowd and said, we will not accept the condition that we have been put in, and we will fight even if we have to die in order to be free. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Jones, Professor Sidbury, Professor Egerton. And we'd like to really just open it up now. We have, we've got plenty of time. We've got a gathering in which many issues have been raised, certainly been given a lot to think about by all three of our speakers. I think among other things, they have really demonstrated that there's a way in which reflecting on the past in this way is also engaging about issues that are still of very much present day relevance. So we would really like to open things up for questions or comments from you, the audience today. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First of all, I want to say that I read your book, and I really enjoyed it. I have it here as a matter of fact. But one of the issues that I'm really confused on when you spoke in terms of religion, that is to me it seemed as if both of you discounted traditional African religion as a basis, or traditional African culture as a basis of where they got their inspiration. Now, there were only a couple of generations, I would assume, from, taken away from Africa. So it would still be fresh because we still have cultural continuities in our culture now. So to assume that, there are a couple of generations out of slavery and all of a sudden they accepted Christianity and this is, what gave them this inspiration, I think is a little bit pretentious. And I think one of the reasons why people had to meet at the church was that was the only place that we can meet. And just because people met at a church would not assume that they were Christian, and it would not assume that they accepted the religion wholeheartedly. As a matter of fact, you mentioned Denmark Vesey. And if I'm not mistaken, Denmark Vesey had with him a man named Gullah Jack. And Gullah Jack was a renowned hoodoo man. Everybody knew it. And as a pact with Denmark Vesey, you had to go through Gullah Jack. You had to take certain oaths and certain, rituals that Gullah Jack made people do. And one of the reasons why people thought that Gabriel's rebellion failed because he didn't make a choice either way. He never said out of his mouth that I was a Christian, but then you had certain people who was in his ranks who wanted to go to the hoodoo people or the juju people or the witches or whatever you want to call them. And because of his lack of doing that, he didn't have the confidence of the people who wholeheartedly who were behind him. So you did get a lot of people who ratted him out and who did, turn him over because they weren't confident that it was going to succeed on that level. And that was my first comment kind of question. And what evidence did you have? Common question. That is it possible to trace his lineage to a particular African nation based on the trade that he had? I know a lot of times they said in the far south, especially in the Carolinas, they took people from Sierra Leone because they were experienced rice planters. So they took those people. What evidence do you have that maybe he came from his father or his father's father was a blacksmith in the tradition of African culture, if you had any of those things?
First, I'm going to stand up too, by the way. I can't speak and sit at the same time. Do you want to go first? Okay. At the risk of sounding really shameless, in my new book on Denmark Vesey, I have a chapter on what I regard as Vesey's melding of African religious traditions with the Old Testament. Let me simply say that Vesey's world, of course, is very different from Gabriel's world. South Carolina is one of the two states that imports large numbers of Africans until the cutoff date of January 1, 1808 in the Atlantic slave trade. Gabriel's world, there's not many Africans, there are some, but it's certainly not like Vesey's world where there are just many Africans in Charleston, and you're exactly right. There's many Africans involved in the conspiracy as his leading lieutenants. Again, it's one of the things you kind of guess at. I take a stab in the book at suggesting that if we could see what Gabriel was actually making, there might be a way. I mean, probably there are things that he's actually forging that indicate elements of African artistry, but we don't have those things. I have fantasies of somebody in some attic having all these letters from Thomas Henry Prosser, maybe something that Gabriel actually made, jailhouse confession. I was hoping that somebody might actually come out of the woodwork after I wrote the book and say, yes, in fact, he was my great grandfather in the same way that my family has, these sort of dyed great aunts who can tell you, who's who all the way back to the 1066. And I never, found anybody like that. I don't know if Jim has either. So, I mean, there's so many things I don't know that I would love to know. How many generations out of Africa is Gabriel? It's possible that he's 2 or 3. It's possible that he's 7 or 8. So I mean, there's all these things that simply are kind of unknowable. And to sort of conclude, and Jim will take a stab at this too, by suggesting that there's kind of a long and complicated argument that I can't really explain in sort of 2 minutes in my book, in which I argue that as Gabriel, I think he probably hires out in Richmond. As he becomes more urban, he becomes sort of less a man of the countryside, less a man of the church, less a man of Africa in some ways. But again, what I've tried to do is kind of extrapolate a few things out of a small number of sources, which I can't prove. Jim, you want to?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. First of all, there's a wonderful book on, it's not exclusively on, but largely on the sort of emergence of these churches in Virginia that time called The World We Made Together by McCall Sobel, in which she really looks at the ways in which African spiritual traditions and Christian traditions, largely in this case from Europe, though it's important to realize that that the Kingdom of Congo at that point was a Christian nation, so Christianity was not a non-African thing. But the way those both informed the emergence of these evangelical churches. And so in talking about, it does seem clear to me that Gabriel and his followers, not all of them certainly, and Doug's certainly right that Gabriel is in many ways the individual for whom it's most difficult to be certain about this in some ways, were members of Baptist churches. And it seems to me very likely that they were quite deeply devout members of these churches. That is, the way in which they trade biblical citations seem to me to suggest that they know the book and they believe the book quite seriously. But to say that is not to say that traditional African notions of spirituality weren't informing their way of approaching Christianity. And Sobel's book is a wonderful sort of analysis of the way that happens. As for the blacksmith stuff, one of the, first of all, to answer your question in the sort of simplest way, no, we don't know. And I don't think we ever will know, short of the kind of fantasy documents that Doug's talking about that we would both kill for. But it certainly is true that the single largest source for enslaved people who were brought into Virginia, the slave trade in Virginia was fairly diverse, and there were people who came from many different places, but the single largest group were Igbos, and blacksmiths played very important roles in Igbo culture. And so there are all sorts of ways one can speculate, and I probably did shamelessly with that, about the ways in which these traditions of the military and spiritual power of blacksmiths in that region of present-day Nigeria may have informed the role that blacksmiths played in the conspiracy. But though having written it, I believe it. I would concede that it's very speculative. That's one of those cases where you just have these snapshots, and figuring out what the movie is just very, very difficult.
Reverend Jones, you? Oh, I'm sorry. Reverend Jones, yeah.
On your far left.
Yes.
I have a question mostly for Dr. Sidbury. I was interested in terms of Gabriel's religion. How much would you think that his religion was a motivating factor for the rebellion, as in Nat Turner's rebellion, where that was really the motivating factor? And if you think it was a motivating factor, do you think just in a general sense, sort of as a liberation theology kind of thing, or do you think that he had a religious experience that set him off on the path toward the rebellion?
I'll take the last part first. That is, there's no evidence of the sort of...
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, to what degree was religion a motivating factor for Gabriel in my view, and especially in comparison to Turner, who reported a sort of transcendent spiritual experience in which he was called to fight slavery, and thus one can make a sort of much more direct thing. There's no evidence at all that Gabriel had that kind of experience. Now, that's not to say he didn't, but I would not claim that he did. There is no evidence that he did of that sort. I would say that the main motivating factor in slave rebellions is slavery. It's not religion, it's not artisanal republicanism, it's not any of these things. It's the brutal oppression of slavery. The ways in which people forged their arguments against slavery are often religion does play a role in that, always other things do as well. I would say religion is one of the very important things in that regard. I wouldn't say it's the motivating factor.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm glad to be here. And I have a different concern and appreciation for why we should celebrate Gabriel. In my studies, we find that he is one of the first freedom fighters. He was a neighbor to Patrick Henry. He was hearing all this language, all this hoopla, you know, so it's only natural, being born here, that he would go with the Spirit also, you know. So I call him, I define him as the first freedom fighter here in these United States. Call him David Liberty because he was born in 1776. That's our part of the story. But the thing is, in regards to the religious aspect, now, it's true that there was evangelical movement going on with the establishment of churches, you know, that was a heavy Masonic movement going also. And that Masonic movement was a secret order. And it seems to me that Gabe would be privy to this Masonic order. And I think there was a linkage between him inviting them into this secret order, which justified and enabled him to maintain secrecy. You know, so Gabe should be recognized for another reason. African American people have burdened under Western intellectual domination. And in our laboring under this domination, we've been cast as slaves, inferior. To raise a people, to raise anybody, to raise an individual, you need to feel good about yourself. You need to feel good about yourself. I'm concerned about my children living in a society and in a city where the subtle messages are that you are inferior. Walk down Monument Avenue, travel down Monument Avenue, and see raised in high esteem men who represented the enslavement of a people is an insult. You turned Richmond into a Confederate museum, and to grow up here and have to be constantly reminded of this, it messes with your self-esteem, let me assure you. And it's time for us as a people to redirect our energies and start lifting up and sending off a message that substantiates the worth of all human beings. And Confederacy and racism does not do that. And so my point is, let's not rewrite, but tell the truth. You know, that at the time of 1800, only European American men who owned land were free men. The truth of the matter is the Declaration only was a concept that was designed to grow and become inclusive. So the truth of the matter is that the fight that Gabe waged for freedom was not just for Africans and not just for Europeans, but for all mankind. And he should go down in history as one of the first freedom fighters.
Any response?
Agreed.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment perhaps on the effect of Gabriel's rebellion on, I'm not sure if the records allow for this or not, but the effect that it had on the southern slaveholding mind and use that term in comparison to, say, Nat Turner's rebellion, which in many ways put an effective end to this issue of, or the discussion on emancipation in the state of Virginia.
Yeah, I think it had quite a big impact, and in the last chapter of my book, I spent a lot of time talking about the laws that were passed after Gabriel. I think essentially what happened is that there was this sort of unconscious movement in the white mind in Virginia, somewhat against slavery until about the mid-1790s, when actually a workable plan was advanced in the state assembly, at which point the planter class had to think seriously about what they were doing, and I think it was 1796, they tabled a very, workable plan. It's very conservative, it's a very gradual plan, but it's not unlike the plans that are being passed in New York at the time, 1799, and in New Jersey, 1804. And I see that sort of as a moment in time, and which I think is also part of Gabriel's motivation. You can see this is kind of coming to a halt. And it's after Gabriel's conspiracy that all these laws are passed, trying to eliminate possible conspiracies like this in the future. So I think it has it has a very negative impact, Gabriel's failure on the white mind. It leads to really clamping down on black Virginians. One of the dangers of publishing a book is you always think about something you should have said after it's out and it's too late. In the book, I suggested there were kind of two possible scenarios. One is that Gabriel succeeds on his grounds, takes hostages, some whites die, Governor Monroe is taken hostage, they barter for black freedom in Virginia, and the other is, of course, what happened. It rains and he dies. It occurred to me after the fact that probably the most plausible scenario is neither one of those. It's that it doesn't rain, the conspiracy does get off the ground, there's a fair amount of bloodshed on both sides, and that does motivate Virginia to finally do something, kind of just force them into action, not out of liberalism, but out of terror, in passing some kind of law for gradual emancipation, maybe also coddled together with some kind of forced colonization. So I mean, the bad news is not only that Gabriel dies, but that his failure to succeed has a very negative impact on Virginia, and therefore the rest of the South. Julius?
Nope. Yes. Sorry.
It's been 15 to 20 years since I read the transcripts, but my understanding of the debate was before the thunderstorm, that there was a great deal of debate about which whites would be spared. And I think there was even a reference that one woman would be spared because she was a good cook, things like that. But my understanding at the end of that meeting was that Gabriel decided that, this could be another time, that most of the whites had to die mainly because of this strategy. And that was his primary purpose there, that the hatred of whites was essential to his plot, that no one be spared. For instance, if you're standing over a man's hand with the axe, you don't have time to ask him to do nothing. Are there any times have I forgotten something 15 years?
The question is about sort of the discussion among the conspirators about the issue of
Basically, was there violent disagreement over who should be spared?
would certain white lives be spared, and what would be the circumstances under which that would be granted, and the question really was about that discussion and what we can know about it among Gabriel and the conspirators.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, it's funny because it's been almost that long since I've read the transcripts too. My memory is not that there are violent disagreements, but there are a number of different explanations of who will be spared or who will not be spared, given at different times by different people, which is not surprising, given the fact that lots of people are talking about this in small groups in different places. And so sometimes no whites will be spared, sometimes, most often, Frenchmen, Quakers, and Methodists will be spared. But it's not that they ever argue about who it will be. It's that at different times, different people say different groups will be spared.
And let me just add to that, the point about when you're studying over somebody with an X, especially outside of Richmond, these folks know who the families are in these houses. And of course, in the case of Nat Turner's conspiracy, they actually sort of go around what house that they're trying to avoid, because these are poor white people and they've sort of done nothing wrong. So in Italy, if the fighting gets into the city, it's going to get very messy. But out near Brookfield, I mean, they know who's in this house and who's in this house. And who's, I mean, Gabriel has a short list of those to die. And of course, top of the list is his master. So obviously there's a huge amount of anger. This is an aggressive man. And here's a man who wants, all kinds of justice, economic justice and otherwise. But I see it as being qualitatively different from the sort of Nat Turner just kind of fight to the end. He talks about, living and prospering in a society once freedom is agreed to. And I don't think that's going to happen if there's just sort of wanton bloodshed. I bet Phil has probably read the transcripts more recently than Jim and I have.
No.
Do you want to wade in here on?
I don't see any motivation to kill all before them. I don't see that. That sounds more like what Matt Turner had to do, because the element of surprise was so important. Sure.
I believe also, isn't that the Cook reference, isn't that apocryphal? I don't recall finding that in the...
I don't remember that.
I think I've seen people refer to that after, but I don't recall finding that in the transcript itself. And I think there's also something sexual attached to that. She's going to cook and be my mistress, and she's white. I think that's a kind of a post 1800 addition. Okay.
Yes, the back.
Hi. My name is Nessa, and I live here in Richmond. And I feel really honored to be in your presence, and I have had the privilege of reading both of your books. Thank you so much for the awesome work that you did. Actually, after reading them and setting a context for this state or this area, we have been fortunate indeed to drink from the chalice of freedom. And in my opinion, and actually from gleaming from your writings, as the gentleman here said, I got that Gabriel was the first person to drink from that chalice and speak for the freedom of all men. Actually, other people had done that, and they had narrow visions. That's judgment and excessive. I'm wondering if you have any idea of how long it might take for all of us to acknowledge that Gabriel did this, and also speak to the idea of eliminating from our languaging the word conspiracy. For in my opinion, again, the conspiracy happened on the other side, and it was a conspiracy against God's nature. Thank you.
First, thank you. Secondly, alas, I have no idea. I wish I did. And thirdly, the one thing I guess I wouldn't do is give up the notion of conspiracy, because I think the sad fact about that society was that denying freedom didn't have to be a conspiracy. It was absolutely open, and
I'm not
people were proud
able to hear you, sir.
That is the only thing I would disagree on, is getting rid of the idea of the word conspiracy, because the sad thing about the society that Gabriel lived in is that denying freedom wasn't something that had to be conspiratorial. It was absolutely open, and people were proud of doing it. And so I'm afraid that it's exactly the fact that he was someone with such an expansive vision of freedom that forced him to be conspiratorial. And that to lose that is to be in danger of losing sight of how ugly that society was.
I thank you, sir, for your comment, and I will not disagree with you at this point, but I would like to.
I think we've been directed by our behind-the-scenes manager. That,
You go as long as you want.
We have time for one more question or comment. Yes.
my personal ancestry is in Caroline County at the time that this would have happened. And I'm a little concerned by, they weren't Methodists and they weren't Quakers, I'm a little bit concerned about the delegate glorification of Gabriel, or Nat Turner for that matter, who even killed infants, his rebellion. And I also am a little bit aware of your history in the General Assembly about the Confederacy, which is part of my heritage, and not honoring it. And I can't see why, if you can't honor my history, I should honor yours, particularly when it would be one of genocide against our people.
Can I go first? Let me just say a word, because we have a different background. My background is North Carolina slaveholders. And I find myself in kind of an odd position, because there's also a discussion going on in Charleston right now about a Denmark Vesey statue. So actually I've been making kind of the statue run this year as I travel around and shamelessly promote my book and talk about statues. And in Charleston, the talk is where to put the Vesey statue, and there's some talk about putting it near a Calhoun statue, who of course was the most articulate defender of slavery. Somebody had a piece recently in the Charleston paper who said, well, both these men were important, and therefore, both statues should exist. My view is that both are important, but only one was right. And Henry Thomas Egerton, who fought for the proposition that he could own slaves. That's my great-great-grandfather. That's my heritage, and it's wrong.
I wouldn't want anybody to misconstrue what I said to glorify or to denigrate anybody's culture. Rather, my entire presentation was to speak about the heinous institution of slavery. And anybody who disagrees with the fact that slavery was not right and slavery was wrong, then we have an issue. I am not about trying to denigrate anybody else's history, but I also would like very much for our culture to join hands with people of African descent in allowing our heritage to stand as a proud heritage, as a heritage that we must not be ashamed of. And anybody who thinks that Gabriel should not have fought for his freedom, I can't understand that. And if indeed he should have fought for his freedom, then we should not push him into some kind of a context of anonymity. We should recognize that, and I think we should celebrate.
Well, I would like to thank our speakers once again for their, and please join me. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you as well very much.